In the quiet, wooded suburbs of Connecticut, life in the late 1970s flowed with a gentle, predictable rhythm. Arne Johnson was a young man who embodied the very essence of honest hard work. As a dedicated tree surgeon, he spent his days high in the branches, coaxing life back into old oaks and clearing away the rot of winter. He was strong, reliable, and deeply in love. His fiancée, Debbie Glatzel, was a warm, bright presence, and together they looked forward to a simple, happy future. In their ordinary world, evil was something confined to Sunday morning sermons or late-night stories. They had no reason to believe that the shadows stretching across their beautiful landscape held anything but the cool promise of evening. The quiet peace they cherished began to shatter when Debbie's family rented a new home. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but it quickly became a gateway to a living nightmare. The trouble began with Debbie's 11-year-old brother, David. A sweet boy, David suddenly became the target of something inexplicable. It started with quiet whispers in the dark that only he could hear. Soon, these turned into physical visitations. David claimed to see an old man with dark, hollow eyes and a distorted face, a figure that promised to steal his soul. The family hoped it was merely the imagination of a child adjusting to a new home, but the truth was far more sinister. David's behavior began to shift, defying natural explanation. The young boy would suddenly collapse into violent fits, his body contorting into impossible angles. He would speak in deep, gravelly voices that did not belong to a child, his eyes rolling back to leave only a terrifying, empty stare. Desperate, exhausted, and feeling entirely helpless, the Glatzel family realized that modern medicine had no answers for the terror unfolding in their home. They reached out to the only people who might understand. They contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, the renowned demonologists who had spent decades investigating the paranormal. When the Warrens arrived, the atmosphere was already heavy with a suffocating, unseen pressure. Lorraine, a gifted clairvoyant, immediately felt the oppressive weight of a malevolent force. Ed began his investigation with a grim solemnity. It did not take long for the seasoned investigators to realize that this was not a simple haunting. The Warrens confirmed that a highly aggressive, multi-demonic presence had targeted young David. This was an organized, malicious gathering of entities, working in unison to break the child's spirit and claim his body as their own vessel. The weeks that followed became an endless blur of terror, and the psychological toll on the family was devastating. Sleep became a luxury none of them could afford. As the entity grew more active and violent in the deepest hours of the night, the Glatzel home became a battleground. Prayers were met with violent screams, holy water caused physical blisters on David's skin, and the air would turn freezing cold in an instant. The emotional stability of everyone in the household deteriorated. Debbie watched in agony as her little brother was tortured by unseen hands, while Arne stood by, his protective instincts pushed to their limits. He was a man of action. Yet he was entirely powerless against the invisible beast tearing his family apart, pushing them all to the brink of madness. The crisis reached a boiling point during a final, chaotic exorcism. The room was thick with the scent of sulfur, filled with the desperate prayers of the Warrens and the agonizing shrieks of the possessed child. David was thrashing with unnatural strength, requiring multiple grown men to hold his small frame down. Arne, emotionally shattered from weeks of torment, could bear it no longer. The sight of the little boy he loved being torn apart from the inside broke something within him. In a moment of pure, desperate love, Arne stepped forward and confronted the unseen tormentor directly. He screamed into the void, demanding that the demon leave the innocent child alone. "Take me on," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Leave him alone and take me instead." It was a fateful, dangerous bargain, uttered in the heat of a spiritual war. Almost instantly, the chaotic storm subsided. David's body went limp, his breathing slowing to a natural pace. The demonic entity had fled, leaving the boy free of his torment. A wave of profound relief washed over the family, believing the nightmare had finally ended. But the victory was an illusion. While David began his slow recovery, an ominous shift had taken place. Arne stood quietly in the corner, his eyes momentarily vacant, reflecting a coldness that had never been there before. He had offered himself as a vessel, and the darkness had accepted. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. In the quiet aftermath of the exorcism, the family celebrated their deliverance, entirely unaware that the ancient evil had not been banished. It had simply found a new, stronger home, waiting patiently to reveal its devastating presence. In the weeks following the terrible ordeal, the shadow that had lifted from young David seemed to settle quietly over Arne. He tried desperately to return to the simple rhythms of his daily life, climbing high into the autumn trees to perform his work, but the world had lost its familiar clarity. A subtle, insidious, creeping corruption began to take hold of his fragile mind. He would find himself standing in the middle of a room with no memory of how he had arrived there, staring blankly at his hands. Terrifying auditory hallucinations haunted his waking hours, filled with guttural whispers and distant mocking laughter that no one else could hear. His once gentle and warm demeanor began to splinter into erratic mood swings, leaving Debbie deeply unsettled. She watched him closely, sensing that the man she loved was slipping away, replaced by a tense, unpredictable stranger who seemed to be fighting an invisible war within his own skin. Hoping a change of scenery would bring them peace, Arne and Debbie moved into a modest new apartment of their own. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a fresh canvas where they could build their future far from the memories of the old rental house. To support their new life, Arne took a job working for Alan Bono, a local kennel manager who quickly took a liking to the hard-working young man. Alan was a lively, outgoing personality, and the two men quickly developed a comfortable, friendly rapport. Yet, even in this new environment, an invisible weight continued to strain every relationship in Arne's life. The laughter in the apartment felt forced, and the silence between the young couple grew heavy with unexpressed fear. Arne continued to suffer from terrifying nightmares, waking up drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs as the phantom growls of the entity echoed in the dark. The gathering storm finally broke on the chilly afternoon of February 16th, 1981. What began as a routine, friendly lunch quickly dissolved into an atmosphere of strange, suffocating tension. Arne, Debbie, and a few others had joined Alan Bono at a local restaurant where the drinks flowed a bit too freely. As the hours passed, the alcohol seemed to peel away the warm exterior of their host, and a bizarre, erratic energy filled the air. Alan became loud and confrontational, his mood shifting unpredictably. Debbie felt a deep sense of unease creeping up her spine, recognizing the familiar, heavy atmosphere that always preceded tragedy. She tried to ease the tension, but the air in the room grew cold, thick, with an unspoken hostility that seemed to target Arne directly. A sudden flashpoint occurred back at the kennel office over a minor, insignificant dispute. The details of the argument were trivial, but the reaction it triggered was catastrophic. Arne stood up, but he was no longer the young tree surgeon his fiancée knew. He entered a deep, trance-like state, his posture stiffening as if seized by an external force. Debbie watched in absolute horror as his eyes darkened, the bright, familiar blue of his pupils seeming to vanish entirely into a cold, pitch-black abyss. An unnatural, terrifying rage took control of his body, erasing any trace of the gentle man who had once sacrificed himself to save a child. The room seemed to shrink, filled only by the oppressive, suffocating malice that had finally awakened from its slumber. Accompanied by deep, guttural growls that did not sound human, Arne drew a 5-inch pocket knife. Before anyone could comprehend the horror unfolding, he lunged forward, unleashing a frenzied, relentless attack. He repeatedly stabbed Alan Bono, his movements robotic and driven by a terrifying strength. Debbie screamed, begging him to stop, but her voice could not pierce the dark shroud that had enveloped her fiancé. When the terrible violence finally ceased, Alan Bono lay mortally wounded on the cold ground, his life rapidly escaping him in the crisp air of the public area while witnesses watched in absolute, paralyzed horror. Arne simply turned and walked away blankly, his face devoid of emotion, like a puppet whose strings had suddenly been cut, leaving a trail of blood and shattered lives in his wake. The police arrested Arne a short distance from the scene, wandering aimlessly down the road. When the fog finally cleared from his mind, he was met with the cold steel of handcuffs and the devastating news of his employer's death. Arrested and deeply confused, Arne wept, claiming to have absolutely no memory of the horrific violence he had committed. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the quiet Connecticut town, but the true sensation was yet to come. In the county jail, Arne was visited by defense attorney Martin Minella, a man who saw past the simple police report. Recognizing the bizarre, supernatural history that preceded the slaying, Martin Minella made a decision that would stun the world. He announced that he would present an unprecedented historic legal defense in a court of law, arguing that his client was not guilty because he had been under the direct and absolute control of a demonic presence. The announcement of the unprecedented demonic possession defense sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of the quiet Connecticut town, igniting a global media circus that transformed the local courthouse into a grand arena of spectacle. Journalists, theologians, skeptics, and curious onlookers descended upon the small community, all eager to witness a historic clash between ancient spiritual beliefs and the rigid, secular foundations of the American judicial system. The small courtroom was packed to its absolute capacity, with television cameras lining the streets outside and reporters shouting questions to anyone associated with the case. Renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren stood prominently beside the defense team, their presence adding a layer of supernatural gravity to the proceeding. The air inside the room was thick with anticipation, as the world watched to see if a court of law would officially recognize the existence of the devil. However, the grand strategy of Martin Minella faced an immediate and devastating obstacle once the proceedings commenced. The presiding judge, determined to maintain the integrity of a traditional courtroom, was entirely unsympathetic to the supernatural narrative. In a stern and decisive ruling, the presiding judge firmly rejected the defense of demonic possession, declaring it legally inadmissible under the rules of evidence. He stated that the law could only recognize scientific, psychological, and physical facts, refusing to allow a trial to descend into what he considered a theological debate. This ruling dealt a crushing blow to the defense team, stripping away their core argument and forcing them to scramble at the last minute to construct a conventional defense that could explain the violent tragedy without mentioning the supernatural forces that had driven it. Despite the severe legal restrictions placed upon the defense, Debbie Glatzel remained fiercely loyal to the man she loved, stepping forward to bear the heavy weight of public testimony. When she took the stand, she was met with a barrage of skeptical looks and intense public mockery from a cynical audience who dismissed her family's experiences as mere delusion or a desperate cover-up. Yet she remained unbroken, speaking with a quiet, emotional intensity that captivated the room. Debbie detailed the terrifying timeline of events that had shattered their lives, beginning with the agonizing torment of her young brother David, and culminating in that fateful day when Arne had offered his own soul to save the child. She described the chilling transformation she had witnessed in Arne, testifying that the violent killer in the kennel was not the gentle tree surgeon she had promised to marry. As the trial reached its climax, the immense responsibility of deciding Arne's fate fell upon the members of the jury. They were left to navigate a complex labyrinth of conflicting testimony, forced to weigh the cold, physical evidence of a brutal stabbing against the haunting, emotional testimonies of a family shattered by inexplicable horror. The atmosphere in the deliberation room was tense and exhausted, with jurors debating for 3 full days. When they finally returned to the courtroom, a heavy silence fell over the spectators. The jury, bound by the strict instructions of the law, rejected the full scope of the demonic defense, but they offered a measure of leniency that acknowledged the bizarre and tragic circumstances surrounding the crime. They found Arne Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter rather than murder. The judge sentenced Arne to a term of 10 to 20 years in prison, a sentence that many believed was merciful given the violent nature of the crime. Behind the high gray walls of the correctional facility, Arne proved to be a model inmate, quiet, respectful, and deeply reflective. He worked diligently, causing no trouble, and earned the respect of both the guards and his fellow prisoners. The bond between Arne and Debbie remained unbroken by the iron bars, their love defying the tragedy that had redefined their youth. In a quiet, modest ceremony held within the prison walls, Debbie and Arne were officially married, pledging their lives to one another in the shadow of their shared trauma. After serving 5 years of his sentence, Arne was released early for exemplary behavior, returning to a world that was still fascinated by his story. Arne Johnson walked out of the prison gates and attempted to rebuild a quiet, private life alongside Debbie, but the shadow of that fateful afternoon in 1981 could never be fully erased from their lives. The extraordinary details of the trial endured, immortalized in books, movies, and endless television documentaries, permanently etching their names into the historical annals of American supernatural folklore. The case remains a chilling, unresolved enigma, a modern Gothic tragedy that continues to challenge the absolute limits of human understanding and the boundaries of legal culpability. It forces us to look deeply into the dark, uncharted corners of the human mind, leaving a lingering, deeply unsettling question that modern science and physical law can never fully answer. We are left to ponder the thin, fragile line between extreme psychological tragedy and actual spiritual horror. We must ultimately wonder if the terrible act was merely the result of a sudden, violent psychological break, or if, in the quiet, wooded landscape of Connecticut, a young man truly sacrificed his very soul to an ancient, malicious darkness that was far older and more powerful than the laws of men.